G'day YouTubers, Spannerman again here with another video. Today we're just going to talk about chainsaw sharpening angles for those that are not too familiar with all the different angles that are out there and what they can do. First of all, if you've got a small saw around about 30 cc's, well, I'd be sticking to the manufacturer's recommendation, which would be 60 degrees head angle, 30 degrees top plate angle. If you've got a semi-chisel chain, which is probably 95% of the chains out there would be semi-chisel, I would stick with the manufacturer's recommendation, because having such a small saw, not a lot of variation, and not a lot of power in reserve on those little small saws. It's only when you get up to around about a 50cc saw that you may be able to tweak some of those, and even then you've got to be a little bit careful, because once the saw starts going a bit blunt, it can bog down, and even a 72cc saw can bog down quite easily if it's not razor sharp. So let's say that you got yourself a 50cc saw and you want to play around with some angles. Well, first of all, if you've got a more aggressive angle, like if we were to talk about the top plate angle, most of the chains being sold would roughly be 25 degrees to 30 degrees. They're the two most common chains. 30 degrees being more aggressive, 30 degrees probably being the most common chain that's out there, best all-rounder. They usually, to my knowledge, don't sell 35 degrees. Normally you've got to file that yourself. Where do you use 35 degrees? Mainly in softwoods. In hardwoods, you can come back to 25 degrees. Now, the other thing is, it's interesting when we talk about power and speed, cutting speed. So if your cutting speed is higher, or we increase the cutting speed, it usually means we've got to have a little bit more power. So if a top plate angle is roughly about 35 degrees, it will use about 75% of the chainsaw's power if the speed is around about 95% efficiency. So if we go to 30 degrees, we could have 100% speed and we'll use about 80% of power. So you can see that that's not a bad one to have. Your 30 degree, 100% speed, you'll get, and you use 80% of your power. So that's a pretty good all-rounder. If we drop down to 25 degrees on the top plate angle, our speed will drop off a little bit and we'll actually use 95% power. So yeah, 25 degrees, that's why 30 degrees is the best all-rounder, because 30 degrees is 100% cutting speed and it uses about 80% power. So the other thing to talk about is the head angle. A lot of people like to call it top plate angle, but I don't want to confuse that with this one here, this top plate angle here. So what some people call it is top plate cutting angle, whereas this is just the top plate angle. But let's call this the head angle to not confuse it with the bottom one. So if we refer to it as the head angle, it's the angle at which the grinding wheel comes in at. It's generally set at 60 degrees. If you set that at 50 degrees, you'll definitely get 100% speed and you'll have about 90%, it'll use 90% power. At 60 degrees, you will have 85% and you'll use 100% power. At 70 degrees, you'll have about 80% speed and you'll use 100% power. So a lot of companies will recommend 60 degrees, but there's nothing wrong with 55 degrees. 55 degrees is a good all-rounder. It's probably about 95% speed and around about 90% power. And if you 30 degrees to me is the best. So if I go 55 on here, 30 on here, and depends whether I've got full chisel as to whether I have 10 degrees downward tilt. So the other thing that's probably most important, even though you can play around with this a little bit and you can play around with this a little bit, The other thing that can have a really major effect is your depth gauges, or rakers as some people call them. Now, when you buy a brand new chain, the actual raker height or depth gauge height on a 3/8 chain, so what we're talking about is that gap that you can see where my finger's pointing into, that gap there will be 0.65 of a millimetre. That's the standard raker gauge setting. And that's designed so that everything's all matched, so that when you put it on, whether it's a 30cc saw, a 50cc saw, a 70cc saw, they all roughly have 0.65 of a millimetre depth. Now you can increase that. Now normally if it's at 0.65 of a millimetre, you'll have about 95% speed, and you'll be using probably just not 90 to 100% of the power. If you increase that depth, say to 0.75, you will have 100% speed, and most likely you'll be using the full power of your saw. Now, where do you go 0.75 of a millimetre? Well, it's actually even recommended by Husqvarna and some of the other companies that you file your rakers for softer timber at 0.75 of a millimetre. Some people even go to 0.9 of a millimetre. If you go to 0.9, your speed will drop off to about 95%, and you'll use 100% power of your saw. And if you've got hard timber, it's not worth doing that. So let's say that you live on a farm and most of your timber's fairly soft. In that situation, you could quite easily keep your head angle here at, say, 55 degrees, 35 degrees on here if it's soft timber, and your rakers quite easily at 0.75, possibly 0.9 if you've got a very powerful saw. So it all depends on how powerful your saw is. So if you've got a fairly large saw, say an MS660, you can get away with that. Say on a 20-inch bar, you'd have no trouble whatsoever. So that's another thing that some people do. They may have, just say you've got a 72cc saw, Farm Boss. They come out with an 18-inch bar on them. But you only maybe use that saw to cut firewood. And your firewood would be no bigger than, say, 12 inches, 14 inches maximum. You'll have no trouble cutting that with an 18-inch bar. Now, if you have an 18-inch bar and you're looking at teeth per minute, there's a lot less teeth on a 18-inch bar than a 20-inch bar. So a 20-inch bar is going to have more teeth and it's going to use more horsepower. So therefore, if you have an 18-inch bar on and you put an 18-inch chain on, you can afford to tweak those teeth and make them a little bit more aggressive. But as I was saying earlier, if you've got a little tiny saw, 30cc saw, probably the best advice I can give you with that is keep it razor sharp and stick standard with it, because that's all it's good for, is cutting very small timber. It's not very good for anything else. I've got an MS170. I've cut timber up to a foot in diameter, very, very slow. Now, when I say I've cut timber, I may have cut 3-4 pieces. But if I bring out my 72cc saw, which is an MS380, 20-inch bar on it, I could cut 14-inch timber all day easily with that, no problem. That's not going to bog down or give me any sort of problem. As long as the chain's fairly sharp, it'll get through it. So that's about probably all I could say about playing around with different angles. You can afford to be a little bit more aggressive if you've got the CCs, or if you went to a smaller bar. Now, interesting enough, I've got an MS170 which comes standard with a 14-inch bar, and I've got an MS180C which comes standard with a 16-inch bar. There's only 1.5 cc's difference between the two bars. So I generally don't play around with any settings on any smaller saw unless it's at least 50 cc's, and then I might play around a little bit. Look, 55 degrees isn't too bad. A lot of people use 55. As I said, 60's quite common. One thing I will say, but if you are playing around with different, and you know, sometimes you hear about this, and you'll hear someone say, "Oh, the professionals, the professionals." Well, who are the professionals? Just because a guy's got a tree, he's an arborist and he's got a tree lopping service, doesn't mean he's a professional sharper. He may be gifted in cutting down trees, because you've got to have a lot of skill in to cut, especially big trees. You've got to be careful where they're for. You've got to judge everything. At the end of the day, when he goes home, he probably doesn't feel like sharpening his chains. He may even drop them off into the local shop and get them to do them, or get somebody else to do them. Maybe one of his other workers sharpens the chains up, takes them home. He might give him $5 or $10 a chain or whatever. As one of my friends is an arborist and he don't sharpen his chains. He says, I can't be stuffed doing that. So a lot of times you hear that, you say, oh, you know, the professionals are professionals. Well, you can be a professional too. Yeah, it's just a matter of learning what works. So don't deviate too much, say, from the standard settings. The standard setting is 60 degrees angle here, 30 degrees on here, and if you're filing, it's the same thing. When you hold your file about 20 to 25% above the tooth, you roughly get your 60 degrees. And your 60 degrees entry angle, if we look at the side plate here, this portion here will be 60 degrees. As you move down, the side plate angle changes. When you're at this point here, it's or this angle here is 90 degrees, and then it starts changing again. So when you've got a radius, it's constantly changing its degrees, and that's why it's important that when you've got a file that you keep it about 20% above so that you get this 60 degree entry angle. 60 degrees works very good. It's been tried and proven. You can't make any mistakes with your 60 degree setting, whether it's on a grinder or whether you're filing. And when we're talking about files, make sure that you're using the right file for the right chain. So, yeah, if you've got a 3/8 chain, that's a 5.2 millimeter file in diameter. So, yeah, people sometimes use the wrong files and they wonder why they've got all sorts of problems. The most important thing about a chain, and we talk, is to keep this top plate razor sharp and this side plate. If you can keep this top plate and the side plate razor sharp, and you can keep your depth gauges, which is extremely important, at the right depth, you will find out that you'll be cutting much better than you've ever cut before, especially the depth gauges. They are so critical. A lot of people get a brand new chain and they sharpen it up and they just forget about the rakers. Then when the chain wears down about halfway, they go, oh, this chain's not cutting very good. Oh, yeah, it's worn down about halfway. Oh, maybe I need a new one. And sometimes they throw it out and go out and buy a new one. They never touch the rakers. They probably don't even own a raker gauge. Probably the guy down at the local dealer doesn't even tell them either. I can't stress that enough. It's actually interesting. I was reading the other day and I just laughed when I saw it. And it says one of the biggest mistakes that people make is not checking their rakers, and therefore the cutting efficiency of their saw goes downhill dramatically. Yeah, so another interesting fact when we're talking about power, before I was talking about speed and power, if you were to use a chainsaw at 10,000 feet, you would find out you lose 30% of your power. So altitude also affects the power output. So yeah, living up in a mountainous area, I don't know how they go with the new 500 eyes. They're all electronic. Maybe they can adjust for that. But just bear in mind, if you do live in very high altitude areas, a couple thousand feet, you may want to tune your chainsaw, just do your air adjustments. Yeah. Anyway, that's getting off track. So just to recap, small saws, don't even touch the settings. It's not worth it. They don't have the power. It's only when you get into your medium type saws, around your 50 to 60 cc's, that you can start to play around with the settings. Even then, if you play around with the settings, I would tend to only play around with the settings when I'm using softer timber. If I'm using really hard timber, you can always back off your 30 degrees to your 25 degrees, less aggressive. You can always, that's why they got 60 degrees here and 30 degrees here, because in most cases it'll get the job done. And as I said, the so-called professionals, while they may be professional at cutting trees down, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they can wear the same hat as a professional sharpener. So yeah, you can be a professional sharpener just the same as anyone else, just by learning how to do things. Anyway, look, that's all for me now. I hope that video helps. It was just a little bit of a talk on different angles and what they may do, and hopefully it can help you. Bye for now. Thanks for watching.